All right, and we're live. And today I just wanted to do a really quick video about a documentary I recently saw the other day. It's entitled Rock in the Red Zone, and this was a film made a few years ago about the situation in Sderot, which is a very small town on the border between Israel and the Gaza Strip. And for those of you who don't know or aren't aware of the situation, during after the Gaza disengagement policy pursued by Ariel Sharon, that was a unilateral policy to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. There were Jewish settlements in Gaza after the Oslo peace accords, so there were Jewish families living within Gaza, even though the territory was technically no longer legally part of Israel. And the Gaza disengagement was a policy to basically, for lack of a better way of describing it, basically just destroy the remaining settlements and forcibly coerce Jewish Israelis who were living there into leaving. So the settlements, which were actually really productive, vibrant little outposts within an otherwise very economically and culturally stagnant area, were destroyed in return for potentially diffusing the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. And it was hoped that this would be a first step towards a permanent peace. And Sharon's goal as prime minister was to use this as the building block to effectively disengage from the entire Palestinian problem. This would finally carve out neat borders between Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza and Israel. And of course, as is shown in this film, it was pretty much a failure. Terrorism in the form of a constant barrage of rockets and artillery on Israeli civilians pretty much exploded, and Sderot became a bombing ground. And one of the interesting things about this film is that it illustrates how the town has become a military encampment, basically a garrison, and you sympathize with the people living there because their government, even though it's technically part of Israel, this is not a settlement. It's not a town inside of the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. It's part of Israel. So technically, what's happening is Hamas and Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and more recently ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups are using Sderot and this part of Israel as a bombing ground to try to kill Jews and basically destroy the economy and wreak havoc. But the Israeli government did not really do anything until they started expanding their reach and hitting towns like Ashkelon and much larger Israeli cities. And that provoked a military response. And I think the film itself goes over some of these things like Operation Protective Edge and Cast Lead. But the film is great, a great tutorial on what it's like to live in this town, which I said is basically like a military garrison. It's like if you've ever read Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove series, what it would have been like to live on the frontier, right abutting the Comancheria, the land held by the Comanches or the Kiowa or Apaches. You're basically in the middle of a warpath, and you, whether you're a man, a woman, a child, you're fair game for terrorism, for murder by people who want to drive you into the sea, more or less. That's their explicit goal, and it affects the psychology of the people living there. There's a psychiatrist who mentions this during the documentary that 80% of the people there suffer from PTSD, and almost every child who's forced, they have concrete reinforced bunkers, but which everyone has 15 seconds to flee to when they hear warnings that of an incoming Qassam. But basically, they have the bunkers, but they also have child bunkers. They've retrofitted play pens to withstand a Qassam rocket, which I don't know if people understand this, but our Qassam rocket is basically a rocket that you would it's basically a modified version, I would say, of a Scud missile. It's like a very crude but nonetheless deadly, equally deadly form of a Scud. So just imagine you're trying to raise a family in a city where you're getting hit with Scud missiles, sometimes every day, sometimes every week. If there's a brief armistice or a hudna, as Muslims call it, which is basically not a peace agreement, but a relenting of warfare until they're more powerful to overcome you. So it might last for a few months if that's the case, but basically you're under incoming fire. It's like living under the Blitz, German V1, V2 rocket attacks, only except for a year or two. This has been going on for over a decade. And the unique focus of the film is the music industry. And when I first heard about this, it kind of reminded me of a Krasakauda, which is an Iraqi thrash metal band who they made a documentary of several years ago, and they were trying to put on heavy metal concerts basically in a war zone where you had Salafi Sunni Muslims trying to bomb and murder you, and Shiite death squads prowling around, and various Saddam Hussein loyalists just murdering people for whatever reasons. And you had this death metal band, which obviously was doing something that was prescribed by the Quran, trying to survive in Iraq. And it kind of reminded me of the situation where you're trying to make art or music under untenable situations, and some of them, the protagonist has to deal with that too. And eventually he winds up moving to Tel Aviv, which in order to progress in his career. And that's a choice a lot of musicians there have to make. But the remarkable thing is how successful they are in producing this music, which has gone on to basically colonize the Israeli music scene. And this is pointed out in the film. What a lot of what we think of as world music, which is a pastiche of different cultural influences and instrumentation and rhythms and melodies, is essentially Israeli music, because you have Mizrahi, Sephardi, and Ashkenazi Jews all coming together to produce different sounds, and they have different aesthetics and different histories that they bring to these compositions. So when you think of world music, to a large degree, you're thinking of Israeli music, and they describe how Sderot was pivotal to changing Israeli music and culture, because the original settlers of Israel, the Yishuv, and even post-war, before the Six-Day War, these were European refugees and exiles, and before that, European settlers. And these were people who had a classical, very European aesthetic in terms of music. And what happened after the creation of Israel, and especially after the displacement of Israeli, not Israel, of Arab Jews from places like Morocco and Tunisia, and you see some of the people in this film wearing fezzes, because it focuses on an Israeli musician whose family came from Morocco, as well as a very talented young girl whose family came from Ethiopia, and presumably for Beta Israel, or one of the Jewish groups in Ethiopia that was evacuated during the 1980s, during the horrible the Derg, the communist regime in Ethiopia. And these were Jews who escaped. But you have all of these different influences from North Africa, from Spain, that changed this European classical musical scene and turned it into literally a world music scene. In addition to the influence of American artists, and that's another theme in this: the influence of groups, English groups like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, and American composers. So it's really a global aesthetic transported to this little town, which captured the entire country's musical scene. So you have everything from acoustic, folk, and rock music to klezmer influence to African percussive music, all coming together to form this unique sound, which is transformed Israeli and subsequently world music. So it's a very interesting film in terms of analyzing the politics of contemporary Israel, the sort of inability of the government or the state to look after the purported interests of its own citizens. That's another theme. There's a great piece of graffiti that they show at one point towards the end of the film, where I forget what the actual translation was, but something like "disengage from the state," and they show protests against the government, which essentially is using Starot as a sort of I don't know how you describe it, but is kind of consigning it to oblivion, basically. And you have an analysis of this quote unquote peace move, which only led to more war, which is a broader critique of the Oslo Accords, which they didn't delve into. But basically, this was billed as something akin to the Good Friday Accords, which, regardless of what you think, how you view giving the provisional IRA and terrorists a political victory, you could at least say it prevented intersectarian violence, if not intrasectarian violence, and also prevented attacks on UK soil. This has done neither. It's neither provided physical security or any sort of lasting peace. So there's that political analysis, but there's also a broader analysis of the discrimination faced, the initial discrimination faced by non-European Jews who made Aliyah and were regathered into the Jewish homeland, and the sort of obstacles they overcame to becoming essentially the leaders of Israeli arts and culture and music. And there's also just a general appreciation of an underappreciated group and what they've contributed to a country's culture. So it's definitely a movie worth seeing. If you haven't seen it, Rock in the Red Zone, I would definitely recommend it.